Okay, a few more people entering, but we'll get started. We just want to thank everyone from the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion to this very special session for Asian Heritage Month. If you're seeing writing across the bottom, that's our closed captioning function. You should also see live transcript or CC icon, depending on where you have your controls. If you click on that, you can hide the subtitles if you find them distracting. Or there are subtitle settings where you can make them smaller or even larger as needed. But we have enabled them. Before we get started, I'm just going to hand it over to my colleague, Anna Bowler, who is our digital learning specialist, and Anna is going to deliver the land acknowledgement today.
Thank you, Leslie. My name is Anna Bowler, and as Leslie mentioned, I am the digital learning specialist with the EDI office. Welcome. Today, I'll be doing the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Shannoungton nations, on lands connected to the London, Township, and Sombra Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. Back to you, Leslie.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I would really like to welcome Amy Go, our special speaker today, to speak about anti-Asian racism in Canada. Amy Go is the president of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. Amy is a social worker by training and has dedicated her professional career to serving newcomers and seniors, promoting and advocating for culturally and linguistically appropriate care and health equity for racialized communities. For over 3 decades, Amy has advocated for social justice and rights of women and racialized communities through her leadership role in national, provincial, as well as local service and advocacy organizations. Amy's currently providing consulting services to facilitate organizational, strategic development, program planning, and review, as well as anti-racism and anti-oppression organizational change. The Chinese Canadian National Council educates, engages, and advocates for social justice and equity for all in Canada. The CCNCSJ has been at the forefront of the movement to combat anti-Asian racism since January 2020. Collaborating with partner organizations, CCNCSJ led the social media campaign Stop the Spread of Racism, launched the #FaceRace campaign, and developed anti-racism education tools for children and parents, and coordinated advocacy efforts calling for government actions to address racism and its impact. With all of these commitments, Amy still made time in her hectic schedule for us. So please join me in welcoming Amy Go to speak to us today. Amy, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate and very kind introduction, Leslie. So I'm going to start sharing screen and hopefully it works. There. So thank you again. It is truly a privilege to be here to speak to colleagues in Western University. And I will share with you later my connection, my family connection with Western. I am actually in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with Mississaugas of the Credit. And of course, it is home to many, many First Nations and Indigenous communities. And it is very important for all of us to recognize that many of us are brought here as slaves, while others came as indentured labor. Our ancestors, our communities have contributed a lot, and in fact have also contributed to the oppression and further discrimination against the Indigenous community. So it is upon all of us, our responsibility to work with in solidarity with Indigenous peoples towards truth and reconciliation and social justice. So I'm going to talk about anti-Asian racism, history of that, and current realities, and specifically Chinese Canadian identity and belonging, and how we would like all of us to work together as allies and as advocates for anti-racism and anti-oppression. So actually, Leslie has already given you an introduction about CC and CSJ, so I'm going to skip that and go straight into the history. So Chinese came first to Canada around 1858, so that gold rush time. And in fact, actually, I should start by saying that at the time, of course, was tremendous discrimination and racism against the Chinese, as already against the Indigenous communities. However, though, the First Nations were the communities that took many of these Chinese people in. In fact, Chinese as well as First Nations worked together on the gold rush and joint ventures, and embrace the Chinese people into their community. So we should forever be thankful. And I will talk a bit more later about how else we have benefited from the generosity and the welcoming gestures from the Indigenous community. So when Canada was going to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, so John A. Macdonald actually promised BC to do that, so that there is this connection across the country from coast to coast, so that BC will join the Confederation. However, white labor was, of course, more expensive. So one way to build this cheaply was to bring in Chinese labor. So from 1881 to 1885, lots of Chinese labor were brought to Canada to build the Pacific Railway, especially across the Rockies, which was the most dangerous part of that railway. And in fact, there was a saying that for every mile of that railway, there was a Chinese worker buried, hurt, and died on the job. And as soon as the railway was completed, John A. Macdonald, as well as others, was very worried about these Chinese people staying in BC and staying in Canada, because they were concerned this will threaten the Aryan character, the pure race, the white race, with these people from the yellow people from China that would breed a Mongol race. And it will then lead to evil. So, and to them, especially John A. Macdonald, what he said was that these Chinese labor were nothing but machines. They were not even people. What's wrong with returning them? So he was really trying very hard to push them back to China, and also discouraged other Chinese from coming. So head tax was imposed immediately on Chinese only, and starting at $50, and it kept going up to $500 in 1923, which was the equivalent of 2 years of wages. You can buy 2 houses in Toronto at the time in 1923, but because Chinese kept coming. So what are you going to do? So what they did was they imposed the Exclusion Act. That means no Chinese could come to Canada. And it started in 1923 until 1947. So this year, in fact, May 4th, was the day that night that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed, and it's the 75th anniversary of the repeal of the Exclusion Act. And of course, all along, the Chinese were not allowed to vote. We were not considered Canadians, even though in between there were generations people were born in Canada. And as well, Chinese fought in the Second World War, even though they were not citizens. They thought that these are Canadian born, they wanted to contribute to fighting for Canada, and they fought in the war. And after they came back, not until 1947, they were considered Canadians and were allowed that citizenship right. And at the same time, there was lots of restrictions, right? You cannot, Chinese people were not allowed to enter professionals, were not allowed to go to med school, law school, all kinds of things. And also as municipalities would impose very, very restrictive thing. For example, in Victoria, you cannot have people carrying rice on the street. Like, who would carry rice other than Chinese and Japanese in those days, right? So there was a lot of racist legislations and policies to really make life very difficult for Chinese. Here, I'm going to bring back the indigenous communities. So after the building of railway, when there were so many laborers facing this very tremendous hard conditions and racist environment, it was the First Nations that welcomed the Chinese. And in fact, many of them did stay within the First Nations communities. In fact, there are parts in BC where there is a significant heritage of indigenous communities that could trace back to the Chinese workers. So again, we should be forever thankful for the indigenous communities for welcoming us. So, and Chinese were not the only ones that were discriminated against in our history. There was the distinct, again, efforts to bar South Asian from coming. It's slightly different for Canada to bar South Asians because India, Pakistan were part of the British Empire. So how can you block the Chinese, the Indians from coming to Canada? You can't do that, right? So what they did was, instead of saying that, well, no Indians could come, so what they said, okay, let's come up another way of not discouraging them to come. So people coming from India in the early 1900s, you can only come in if you have this one continuous ticketing arrangement, which was not possible in those days because it's such a big span of land and ocean from Canada to Asia. So it's not possible to have one continuous journey. So no Indians could come. And in 1914, 376 prospective immigrants from India, from the Punjabi province, tried to come to Canada via Hong Kong on the boat called Komagata Maru. And they landed and docked in Vancouver Harbor, were not allowed to disembark. So for months, they were just sitting. 2 months, they were on the boat in horrendous condition, and eventually turned back to India. Many of them actually died on the boat and subsequently suffered persecution upon returning. So Canada has always a very creative way to bar Asians from coming, and Japanese Canadians no exception. When Japan was at war with Canada, right away, Japanese were deemed aliens. And don't forget, most of these Japanese in Canada at the time were already generations in Canada. They were born here, and most of them were in the farming rural community across BC. And they've been, in the fishery as well as the agriculture industry. And when this War Measures Act was enacted, they were deemed enemy aliens, and Canada interned them, paid by them, because Canadian government confiscated all the properties of the Japanese, interned them into interior BC, and they were forced to stay there, pay for their own imprisonment, pay for their own war camps, and suffered tremendously throughout that internment period until, of course, the end of the war. And so Japanese Canadians, Chinese Canadians all fought for redress. So Japanese Canadian got their redress first under the Mulroney government, and then in 1986 or 87, and then Chinese got redress for head tax and exclusion act in 2006. It took years and years for Japanese and Chinese Canadian community to successfully seek redress, and most importantly, an apology from our Canadian federal government. So what does all this mean? So you can see the consistent exclusion, right, barring of these Asians from coming to Canada on the premise that these Asian race, these dirty yellow peril, these dirty people will taint white race. And so forever, Asians in Canada were seen as perpetual foreigners, right? Ship you back. Send you back to Asia, go back to China, go back to wherever. You were always deemed as foreigners, regardless. You could be here for generations. And there is also, of course, the Moldo minority myth that continued to hurt and harm us. And what does that mean? The Moldo minority myth came during the 60s in the US when the African Americans were fighting for their civil rights. And so these white people in the US were saying, well, look at the Japanese, look at the Chinese. They were silent, they were quiet, they were subservient, they were just doing, sort of keeping their heads low and doing their job. Why can't you be more like them? It was definitely trying to divide and conquer the racialized community. So this Moldo minority came from the US, but also continued to spread and continue to be very much part of the life and part of the reality of being Asians in Canada. And as well, of course, we are treated as a homogeneous group, regardless of where we're from. Go back to China, or go back to India, go back to Pakistan, regardless of whether we are from those places or not. And continue, we suffer microaggressions, in terms of particularly highlighted during COVID, and which I will speak about. So during COVID, as we can see, racist attacks against Chinese Asians was significantly increased. And from that between 1919 to 2022, the police reported crimes motivated by race or ethnicity increased by 80%. And most of these actually pertain to East and Southeast Asian communities. And many of these reports, for example, in Vancouver, Toronto, like for example, in Toronto in the year 2020, there were 57 hate crimes reported. 41 of those were reported from the East and Southeast Asian communities. And we also worked with partner organizations that were hosting websites for people to report their own experiences with hate. And between 2020 to end of 2021, over 1,100 incidents were reported. But in fact, there was a 47% increase from 2020 to 2021 in terms of hate incidents. And 60% of the victims were women, and particularly young people were targeted. As young as a grade schooler, they were called Corona Girl by their teacher, by the principal, or Vietnamese young boy was told by their fellow classmates that you are to be blamed, like you brought this mess to us. So all these show the proliferation of anti-Asian hate. And more importantly, it's the brazen, this, emboldened, attacks. It's as if, open season. It's okay to call dirty Chinese. It's okay to tell people to go back to China, regardless whether we're from China or not. And it's okay to attack. It's like this sort of like this really sense of it's okay to be racist, because these Asians will continue to and harm, like bring peril and disease to Canada, and it's okay to target them, and it's okay because they will stay silent. So what happened with all these racism that we are, living in? Of course, we have higher incidence of poverty, and this is the Statistics Canada that recently released a report during Asian Heritage Month at the beginning of May, that the poverty rates in 2020, there are 3 largest visible minority groups in Canada that have a higher national average. There was South Asian, Chinese, and Blacks. And these were all higher than the national average in terms of poverty rates. And Chinese seniors, in fact, had the highest poverty rate amongst, in fact, racialized as well as other seniors, and they're white compared to white seniors. And in Ontario, 2016 census, 23% Chinese live in poverty. And then there was a study done by U of T and now Toronto Metropolitan University, then Ryerson University. A joint study showed that if you apply, for example, me, with my last name Go, will have 30% less chance to be called for interview. And if I use my full name, I would have even less chance to be called for interview. And this is just a paper based on resumes. And so this kind of racist reality have impacted on our life, our access to employment, access to opportunities, and of course the poverty that we of course suffer disproportionately. So of course it impacted us, right? Our identity, our belonging. If somebody keeps telling you that you don't belong here, regardless whether you are from, that originally you're from or you were born, because I have friends who are 5th generation and their grandniece and nephew would be 7th generation. And can you imagine consistently being told that you don't belong? And so because of the racist immigration policy, of course, our communities, particularly the Chinese Canadian communities, are predominantly immigrant community. 70% of Chinese were born outside of Canada. And so when you're facing the reality of constantly being told that you don't belong here, there is this cultural, language, and heritage connections that we hold on to, because that is who we are. That is the pride that we have. This is our dignity, and which can never be stripped by regardless of the racist environment, regardless of the hate incidents that we are subjected to. However, though, that sense of belonging is where we continue to feel challenged, that we continue to be threatened. And this unique Chinese Canadian identity that we built through generations, through connections with Canada, through connections with our home in Canada, that unique identity is also being threatened and being challenged constantly. So I'm going to share a little bit about my family, because one of the sort of like a theme that I was told to address was about contributions of Chinese Canadians. And so I'm going to share with you my own family. The person with the mask is Avigo, my sister, who was a lawyer, clinic director of the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, very active in advocacy, very, very strong, activist for human rights, for anti-racism, for anti-oppression movements. So she recently, in fact, last year, September, was appointed to the federal court, the first Chinese Canadian judge in our court, in our federal court. Our federal court has a very long history in Canada, of course. I believe we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of our federal court this year or next. And AV is the first Chinese Canadian. And in fact, they were predecessor, because there's always a court level that is similar. And AV was the first after this such a long time. So, you know, you can say, of course, AV worked very hard as an immigrant. We came to Canada, first generation. We came as to study first in university and then build our career, build our home here. But for AV and for us to see AV become the first Chinese Canadian federal court, of course, speaks to her, of course, as her own achievement. But more importantly, speak to, I think, the failure of our system to recognize the diverse skills, the talents, and the untapped talents of so many racialized strong legal minds and bright legal minds up there that still are not tapped into. And so the persons beside AV is my niece, and this is my connection to Western University. This is her picture, her high school after her finished her, I think, yes, after she finished her university, sorry. And we took a trip to Europe, and she was, she graduated from U of T, and she was very interested to become a doctor ever since she was like a teenager. She did get into Western University, graduated in 2011, and now is a specialist, an internal medicine specialist in Toronto in a hospital. So of course you can say, wow, you know, again, Stephanie worked very hard and achieved where she is. Let me tell you about Stephanie's father. Stephanie's father is my own brother, who came to Canada as an immigrant, as an adult. He was trained as an architect and from the Philippines. My family has a background in China, Hong Kong, and Philippines. And my brother had never worked a day as an architect in Canada because his credentials, his experiences, his training was never recognized. Never recognized. If he had wanted to go back to do his get his architecture degree credential, basically he had to start over again. And of course, you know, as an immigrant, he had to, you know, with the young family at the time, Stephanie was less than two when they first came to Canada. He had to work. He had to support the family together with my sister-in-law, who was a bank manager. Of course, never became a bank manager here, you know, lucky that she went back to the banking industry. So the story is, yes, these are my family. We worked very hard. However, though, the systems have not been kind to us. The system have continued not be kind to not only my family, but many, many other families, be it from China, from Philippines, from India, from, you know, from other places. And you could be Canadian born and Asian Canadians. The system has not been kind and continue to make your life harder, continue to marginalize you, and continue to make it hard for you to advance and achieve. So what can we do together? I hope that, you know, that we will always apply an anti-racism and anti-oppression lens to policies and system review so that, you know, Western University, for example, would look at its system, its hiring practices, its, you know, its curriculum, its policies. Are we are we making life more difficult? You know, are we truly welcoming? Are we truly inclusive of Asian students, Asian Canadians, and other racialized students? And are we truly recognizing the talents and skills of the faculty from diverse communities, from diverse racialized background? Are we having policies that discriminate and make it hard? If there are people experiencing racist harassment, attack, misogyny, sexist attacks, and also, discriminatory treatment, are the policies and system in place to protect them, to uphold their rights? So I would, ask Western University to think about that. And as a whole, we really have to look at what are the policy system change that we need to put in place. Currently, the federal government is reviewing and revising its Employment Equity Act. I made a presentation to the task force. I hope all of us will pay attention to that and address those issues. Employment Equity Act only deals with federally regulated industries and, of course, federally, the public service of federal government. However, we are asking the government to make the Employment Equity Act beyond just the 4 targeted groups: visible minority, indigenous, francophones, as well as people with disabilities. Oh, sorry, women. Francophones, people with disabilities, as well as indigenous, as well as visible minorities. The issues that we faced with the legislation, the visible minority term is completely outdated. It's completely meaningless. So we are asking the act to change to racialized communities, and we are asking the act to expand beyond so that the LGBTQ2S communities would be included, so that the people who suffer from discrimination due to faith, due to their religion, due to their spiritual practices, such as Muslim, such as Jewish communities, such as others, will also have the chance to thrive and the chance to have the opportunity to develop and grow. So in order to do all that work, we need disaggregated data. We need data to show where the discrepancies are, where the inequities are. So StatsCan has been trying now, opening that door and trying to continue to look at disaggregated data. And we urge all organizations, including Western University, to do that. And of course, we also need to look at hate crimes and hate incidents reporting. We are not suggesting that all these reporting go to the police, not at all. We believe that communities have a role to play because of, as we know, a long history of systemic barriers that communities are facing in the law enforcement and criminal justice system. So we need to have a system of reporting and following up that are rooted in the communities, that the communities have the resources to support those who unfortunately were victimized by hate. And we also, of course, need curriculum education changes so that the history of Chinese Canadians, South Asian Canadians, Japanese Canadians, and other communities, those stories are told consistently and told by us. The narratives are driven by us, not by the others. And we have to, of course, challenge. Ultimately, it is a system that is perpetuating the power of certain groups and others. So we need to continue to challenge that. We need to continue to challenge stereotypes and stigma. And we also need to recognize the diversity of Asian Canadian communities, as well as our diaspora and regional differences across the country. So I'm going to pause here, and I welcome the opportunity for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Amy, for that fantastic presentation. It was really, really insightful. So now we have some time for questions, and you can leave your questions in the Q&A so that we can read them to Amy. Amy, I have a question myself. So thinking about the population in Canada and how we can support you, what advice can you offer to the general population in Canada to fight anti-Asian racism?
So I think each and every one of us has a role to play. First of all, we really need to learn our history, right? Learn Canadian history, learn the history of Chinese Exclusion Act, of head tax and Japanese internment, right? And Kamagata Maru. Like, we need to learn our history, learn about slavery, the long, long impact of slavery, not of, Caribbeans and Africans, not just in Canada, but across the globe. So we should just enrich our knowledge, right? And then we can take whatever position in whatever arena that we have, the little influence, speak to family, speak to, your colleagues. And whenever you see something is wrong, speak up, right? Identify what's wrong with that. Why can't we have a dialogue about that? And then so that that we can have more champions, amongst us who are willing to confront racism, confront discrimination, confront oppression. And so that would be my plea to all of us to exercise our right and our responsibility as Canadian.
I agree with you 100%. I think that as members of the community and as members of our society, we all have a responsibility to stand up as bystanders, as and not only as the target. Like, not only the target is the one who can respond or who has to respond. Sometimes it is the responsibility of the bystander to say something. So thank you for bringing that up. I think we have one question in the chat. How do you feel about the term BIPOC? The question is explained. I sometimes feel further marginalized during discussions about racism because there is so much more attention given to anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. I feel that Asians often fade into the background.
So thank you for that question. First of all, I think it's important for us to recognize that we are not in competition, right? Any group got trampled on. All groups got trampled on, right? So if we have anti-Black racism and continue to have anti-Black racism, there will be continuing anti-Asian racism. There will be continuing, anti-Indigenous racism. So I think it is important for us to recognize that we cannot allow any form of racism, any form of discrimination, period, right? As well, I believe that there is shadism. I believe there is this hierarchy, and I do believe that Asian Canadians, we have to be mindful of our own discrimination, of our own stereotypes and misinformation. Because, as I said, the impact of slavery is not just a Canadian issue, and the impact of colonization is not just Canada. It has impacted the world around, right? And so if we take that premise, if we recognize that, that means many of us have been subjected to the same kind of, of that concept, right? Of Black people, of being the most sort of like not how should the discrimination of the Blacks are just so entrenched because of slavery, the history of slavery. So I think it is important for us to examine that and recognize that. And so many of us are immigrants from around the world. And where we are from, we have not been kind to the Indigenous and of the land where we are from, and we have not been kind to the Blacks and the Africans or the Caribbeans where we are from. So I think it is important to understand that and examine that and reflect upon that. And so for us as Asian Canadians, we need to really truly take that responsibility as well, right? I'm not suggesting that we ignore anti-Asian racism, not at all. That's why I'm here. I will continue my efforts and my journey in fighting anti-Asian racism while I continue in solidarity with my friends in the anti-Black racism movement, while I continue with the Indigenous community fighting for truth and reconciliation. So, however, we do need to recognize that global context of colonization, as well as the global impact of also oppression against Indigenous. It's not, again, a unique Canadian experience. It's global across the world. And so we really, as Asian Canadians, have the responsibility and to recognize that we need to, first of all, understand if one community is down, all of us are down. And we can never allow that to happen. We may, just like me, I focus my energy on fighting anti-Asian racism because of my own identity. But I do work in solidarity. I do partner with communities to fight against all form of oppression, because we simply cannot allow any one of us to be down.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. There is also a comment that ends up with a question, but I think it's more than as a comment, presented as a comment. It says, you did a great job of describing the history and the effect on the present, but the 2 million Chinese Canadians are also the most prosperous and integrated compared to any other country in which they have a large presence, such as the USA, Australia, etc. For example, Minister Mary NG, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, is among the key players on the world stage for Canada. So can we focus on their achievements too?
So thank you again for that very good question. And as I mentioned, even my own family, I'm proud to be part of a family with my sister being the first and only still federal court judge, who happens to be Chinese Canadian, a woman, right? And while I celebrate the achievement of my sister and Minister Mary Ng, I also cannot ignore the fact that 23% of Chinese Canadians are poor. I cannot ignore the fact that Chinese Canadians across Canada have a higher poverty rate. Like, in my own conscience, I cannot do so. And so when I recognize achievements, I also want us to be aware that the system has not been given us that opportunity, so that more Mary Ngs, more AV Go, more others can also thrive and develop and do the best that they can, right? So I'm not suggesting that we don't celebrate. Of course we celebrate. Since AV was appointed as the first Chinese Canadian judge, do you know how many young lawyers came to us and came to her and say, oh, wow, that means we have a chance too. Of course that, but it also says that, after decades, then we have this one judge, right? What about the many others before AV who should have been judges, who were denied that opportunity? So I definitely want to celebrate achievement, celebrate all that. At the same time, let's continue to challenge the system so that more and more AV goes, and not just her, but many others from Asian, from Black communities, from other communities, and would be appointed and will have the same chance to really make Canada better, right? To be on the world stage, to be on the national stage, to make an impact. So I hope, I'm not suggesting that, that we don't. but I just cannot ignore the context, the system that we are in. So I think it's a marvelous question, and thank you for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. Yes, I think it's also a matter of like creating awareness and making sure that the history is clear.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have one more question. Why do you think that the targets of anti-Asian racism are a younger generation? And now I'm thinking about the so many students who are coming to Western to first year, and how they might have experienced racism. What recommendations do you have for that younger generation that is being targeted?
Yes, yes. So again, thank you very much for that very good question. And let me speak again with my own personal experiences. So because of COVID and anti-Asian racism, CCNCSJ actually initiated a project. And first of all, I had the privilege and honor to be speaking to many, many community members across the country in Mandarin, in Cantonese, in English, professional as well as workers and frontline people throughout the pandemic. So we initiated this project to develop anti-Asian racism resources for parents so that they can engage their young children in dialogue about racism. And in order to do that, we actually hosted focus groups in Vancouver and Toronto in English, Cantonese, and Mandarin, with young children as young as grade 3 all the way to, I believe, grade 5, right? Some of them were really young. And then we also had parents, right? And I hosted some of the sessions myself. There is one key theme that came up, was that families don't speak about racism at home. These East Asian Chinese family don't speak about racism at home, in spite of the fact that children have experienced that in school, parents have experienced that in school. I still remember this a woman, when she first migrated to Canada, for 5 years, she had to take a job, right? A frontline job. For 5 years on the first job, she felt marginalized and bullied in the workplace, being Asian, being Chinese. But she did not complain. She truly just kept her, head down, kept silent. She needed that job. She needed to build that Canadian experience in order to move on. Otherwise, without Canadian experience, you can never move on. So for 5 years, she suffered in silence. She never talked to her children about that, right? And then when we talk to children, interestingly, the younger children, of course, could not really grasp, right, what is racism. The older one knew. And you know what they said? Oh, these are my friends. They were just joking, right? So, and then, of course, when you ask, they never talked about that at home. So even though older children knew something was wrong, but it's to protect their own sanity, right? Of course, and when I actually talked to some professionals, it was heart-wrenching because COVID was such a triggering for us. Many Canadian-born or many first-generation Asians who came as a young children and went through the school system here. I would say 99.9% would share with us their experience with racist encounter throughout their school years. Some as blatant as physical, some less so, regardless whether in Toronto, in small town. And in fact, some of them, because of now that they are parents, they had to move their children out of school in order to address that need for their children to stay away from being bullied. So, I like it's the microaggressions that we experience are just part of our life. So I think it is important for any school, like including Western, to recognize that. And I'm sure it's true for racialized, for Black students, right? Particularly, of course, Indigenous students, of course. Let's recognize that's just the facts of life for us being in Canada. And so how do we provide this nurturing environment for them, recognizing that, some of them may have spoken up, some of them may have moved schools, some of them may have, some may not. I would say majority of them, facts of life, right? Have not even raised that. But as school, we need to recognize that, right? So that they can truly develop. And university, that's the goal, isn't it, right? Is to help somebody grow, somebody come to know themselves even better, right? Somebody to develop their own sense of self-esteem, self-worth, as well as confidence and trust in themselves, right? And of course, accompanying that would be the skills, the knowledge, and the experiences. So how do we, as school, to recognize all that, right? And recognize where the students may be from in their past, that trauma. So many people now talk about trauma informed, right? I'm a social worker, right? When I started social work, there was, what do you mean trauma informed? What is it, right? We never talked about that. But more and more awareness is raised across at least or some service sector, particularly mental health, right? Trauma-informed care. To me, when you talk to, if you had the opportunity I had to speak to all these community members about their experiences, those are trauma. And that's why COVID was triggering all these past trauma. It was like nobody came out of that session with dry eyes. Like we were all come out like in tears because it was so traumatic. And so I would hope that Western University, just like other education institutions, would be informed by that, would be informed by trauma, right? Would be informed by supporting students to so that it's truly nurturing. So that if they, first of all, the environment will not tolerate any form of, oppression, racist bullying, sexist bullying, or homophobic, bullying. No, right? The school has to be very clear in terms of how you're going to deal with that so that the victims would know where to go, get support, and would not feel further victimized. At the same time, in all the work that you do in the curriculum, in all the teaching, please be informed by that. And I would hope that the faculties, all the teaching staff, all your teaching assistants, all the tutors, all have some training about trauma-informed care, and all have some training, of course, anti-racism, anti-oppression, so that when you're talking and sharing your curriculum and sharing your knowledge, you are coming from that angle and you are coming from that perspective of equity and inclusion.
Thank you, Amy. I think that Leslie has a question.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Amy. Along that, or kind of following that note, Amy, we consistently hear from our students that representation matters. So people like Avi, your sister, and ministering are really positive role models. But, I think from our perspective at Western, to your point, we want to make sure that we have systems in place to support students, staff, or faculty. Right. But I was going to ask you, and I think I ask a lot of speakers this, because I think it is something that people don't like to talk about or necessarily report. And we do have a reporting structure in place. It's been modified in the last few years. through our Human Rights Office that it can be anonymous. But I mean, there is, and I know of situations outside of Western, friends and colleagues of mine in a work situation who, like the person that you spoke of, they just say, you know what, I'll look for a new job. I'm not going to go to human resources. I'm not going to report it. And I'm wondering if you have any insight to help us encourage people to report, because we can't fix, I mean, we know things are broken, but you know, it would help us dedicate our efforts.
Right. So I would, rather than, I mean, yes, reporting and know where to go and know that there's like, you know, support system is very, very important. But instead of promoting reporting, maybe we can promote the culture of inclusion, right? So that we will not tolerate, right? So Western University is a place where you can come. You will be free from harassment. You will be free from that kind of exclusionary, discriminatory. So that promotion, right? So then you should, I would hope that our energy is spent on saying that, right? Saying that here, come here because we will. And so everybody, regardless of fellow students, fellow faculty, fellow, you know, teaching staff and all that, what does that mean to not to harass? Like, what does that mean to be this inclusive, welcoming place that truly make people belong, right? So maybe that's where we should start, right? It's from that and build that asset, right? Because more and more people are saying like asset-based, you know, strength-based approach. And actually, I agree. I agree to a large extent. Of course, you have to deal with cases when something happens, right? But maybe that's where we can start, because then people would know that this is what it means to be a nurturing place, right? This is what, so my behavior, my actions have to align with this expectation of a welcoming and inclusive place, right? So regardless of whether faculty and staff or whoever, right, and students, this is the code of conduct that we all have to live up to. And so hopefully that is a more preventative measure than, oh, come and report, right? And of course, when you have a code, that means when somebody break the code, you can go and just like, you know, I find like professional code, people can, like my niece had to take the code for the dog, because I went to her white coat. So I went to everything at Weston for her. Of course, we're so proud of her, you know, her oath, right? People can understand there is a professional oath, right? There's a professional oath for professionals, like, you know, and so there is a code of conduct. But when, you know, people less understand what does that mean to be a code of inclusiveness, code of, you know, belonging, right? So maybe we should build on those, right? Is to make sure that that environment, and so that people can examine and understand my actions have to follow this code and follow this principles and value.
This is beautiful advice, Amy. Thank you so much. I was taking notes for the future, because these are great ideas that we can definitely take into account in our office. So I just wanted to say thank you. I don't think we have any more questions. And on behalf of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing about your work, about your passion, about your experience and your family as well with us. And thank you to all the participants who were here with us and for spending this time with us and learning more about Asian racism and everything that has been happening in the last years, and including that history, that long history that we have in Canada. So thank you so much. And with this, I think that we conclude the session. Leslie?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.